While on patrol in an affluent neighborhood, a racist police officer notices a black man walking. The officer arrests the man without cause because he believes he must be up to no good. A high-ranking general in the U.S. Army is later told that the officer arrested him. With his footsteps soft on the pavement, General James Adams walked down one of these streets lined with trees. James had a tall stature and a muscular physique that suggested he had served in the military for many years. Despite his laid-back demeanor, he exuded authority through his posture and manner of carrying himself. Although not everyone knew it, James had visited this neighborhood numerous times before. A few blocks away, he owned a home that he had bought years prior as a peaceful escape from the pressures of his job. He found that this was a place to reflect, relax, and get away from the demands of his job. As he usually did, he chose to enjoy the late afternoon sun and the street silence by going for a walk today. Unaware of the events that would soon disrupt this peaceful routine, James continued walking as the sun dipped lower, creating longer shadows. For the moment, he was just another individual finding tranquility in the everyday moments life had to offer while savoring the simplicity of a late summer afternoon. As he drove slowly down the street, Officer James Davis adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes sweeping the neighborhood like a hawk looking for prey. The engine of his patrol car purred softly as it crawled along. He had performed this routine innumerable times before, keeping the streets of this wealthy suburb safe and tidy. As the first line of defense against anything that could disrupt the community's tranquility, Davis took pride in his work. The silence in the neighborhood was almost oppressive. Davis's hand was on the steering wheel, tapping absently to a song that was barely audible over the hum of the car. He observed the same scenes: gardeners pruning hedges, kids riding bicycles leaning against fences, and the occasional dog walker or jogger. Everything appeared to be typical. Then he spotted him. A black man strolling down the street by himself, as casual as you like. The man's appearance caused Davis's eyes to narrow. He wore jeans and a simple white t-shirt and was tall and muscular. He didn't seem hurried and his stride was easygoing. Although there was nothing especially concerning about him, Davis's mind was alarmed by the sight. His suspicions were aroused by the fact that he didn't recognize the man. "Who are you?" Davis continued to stare at the man while muttering to himself, "What are you doing here?" After 10 years of service, Davis had gained enough experience to trust his gut, and he knew something wasn't right. This was a wealthy neighborhood with a large white population. According to Davis, people who didn't fit the typical mold were frequently up to no good. Perhaps the man was looking at houses or was lost. In any case, Davis had no intention of passing without learning more. In order to keep up with the man's pace, he further reduced the car's speed. He saw the man, calm and uninterested, glance at the car for a moment as he passed. Davis's jaw tensed. He didn't like that composure. It seemed as though the man belonged there and wasn't at all bothered by his presence. It didn't sit well with Davis. After making a snap decision, he parked his patrol car at the curb. With the radio clipped to his shoulder and his belt adjusted, he stepped outside. Apparently not aware of the officer's approach, the man kept on walking. A glimmer of irritation flickered through Davis. He approached the man and spoke louder. "Hey, there you are," Davis yelled. The man came to a halt and looked at Davis. His eyes were steady and unflinching as he stared right at him. "Yes, officer. Is something wrong?" he inquired. Instead of responding right away, Davis paused to examine the man closely. The man appeared to not perceive Davis as a threat because of his composed expression and easy stance. That only made Davis more suspicious. "What are you doing here?" Davis's tone was sharp as he demanded. "Just taking a walk," the man said calmly in response. "Is that not allowed?" Davis scowled. The man's tone, so composed and unconcerned, didn't sit well with him. Because Davis enjoyed being in charge, it made him feel as though he wasn't. He squared his shoulders and stepped forward. Davis stated, "I'm going to need to see some ID," in a commanding tone. The man did not move, but he raised an eyebrow. "Why am I being accused of something?" Davis was getting impatient. "This neighborhood is private. People like you are uncommon in this area. Anyone who seems out of place may be questioned by me." Davis's irritation increased as the man's sigh became softer. "I live nearby," he introduced himself. "Just a couple of blocks away. Officer, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just having fun taking a stroll." "Show me some ID," Davis said again, his hand automatically going to his belt, which held his radio and other power tools. His training had taught him that control was key in these circumstances, so he wasn't in the mood for resistance. Slowly and deliberately, the man took his wallet out of his pocket. He displayed his identification to Davis by holding it up. Taking it, Davis looked at the address and name. Surprise flashed in his eyes. Even though the address was for a split second local, he still didn't feel comfortable. Perhaps it was Davis's own sense of duty taking over, or perhaps it was the man's composed manner. "I've never seen you around here before," claimed Davis. "How long have you lived here?" in a firm tone. The man said, "Several years. I work most of the time so I don't go out much. I fail to see the need for this." Heat rose in Davis's face. He disliked being questioned, particularly by someone who appeared to believe they were above the law. He gripped the man's ID more tightly. "Necessary or not, I have a job to do," Davis curtly said. "Suspicious activity in the area has been reported. I must ensure that everything is in its proper place." The man continued to stare at Davis without saying anything. His expression showed no signs of fear or retreat. Davis detested the fact that he was the boss here, not some random person who believed he could go wherever he wanted to go. He needed to show his dominance. "Stay right here," dictated Davis. "Don't move." In order to run the ID, he turned and went back to his patrol car. His heart was pounding a little quicker now, a mixture of annoyance and doubt, which he didn't want to acknowledge. When he arrived at the car, Davis looked again at the man who was waiting in silence. Something about this whole thing didn't feel right, and Davis's chest began to ache. However, he dismissed that idea. It was his responsibility as a law enforcement officer to maintain the safety of this community. Right now, he couldn't afford to doubt himself. As he began entering the man's information into the system, Davis sat in his patrol car and watched the man through the rearview mirror. Like a storm cloud waiting to burst, a feeling of unease persisted. As Officer Davis made his way back to his patrol car, James watched from the sidewalk. Even from a distance, he could feel the weight of the officer's scrutiny. Only the faint chirping of birds and the hum of Davis's patrol car could disturb the stillness of the street. James maintained his composure by breathing steadily. He knew he had done nothing wrong, so he had nothing to hide. But his muscles were tense from the way Davis stared at him, the questions, and the demand for his ID. The conversation was replayed in James's mind, including the officer's tone, his insistence that James was not fitting in, and the way his hand had lingered close to his belt as though it were about to do something. James was familiar with the expression. He had witnessed it numerous times while serving. It was a mixture of distrust and power, frequently aimed at people who were viewed as abnormal or out of place. It was a glance that, if not managed carefully, could turn into something much worse. James looked around. Some people were now observing from a distance, stopping in their yards or looking through windows to see what was going on. Water spilled onto the sidewalk as a middle-aged man with a garden hose in hand gazed openly. There was a woman who had stopped walking her dog and had her phone out, seemingly ready to record. She looked away after James briefly locked eyes with her. He inhaled deeply and slowly. A confrontation, a scene, was the last thing he had desired. Davis continued to work on his computer while he was still in his car. James was aware that the officer was looking through his records and running his ID in an attempt to find a reason for the stop. The fishing for reasons that didn't exist in the first place was something James had witnessed previously. He didn't like it, but he also knew that getting angry wouldn't make things better. He told himself to be patient and let it happen. With the ID still in his hand, Davis got out of the patrol car. His expression was one of annoyance. In an attempt to establish his dominance, he stood a foot away from James and walked back over to him. Davis remarked, "Your record's clean," with a hint of disappointment. "However, that doesn't clarify your purpose for being here." James calmly answered, "I already told you. This is where I reside. I'm just going for a walk." Davis squinted his eyes. "As I previously mentioned, there have been reports of questionable activities. It is my responsibility to investigate." James maintained a steady gaze. "I'm not causing any trouble, officer, but I do understand that. I'm merely strolling." Davis's annoyance was now visible as his face flushed a little and a frown formed on his forehead. He looked around and saw how few people had come to see them. He disliked being challenged, particularly when it was in front of other people. James could feel the change, the slight edge infiltrating the officer's posture. "Look," Davis said, lowering his voice. "We have two options, the easy way or the difficult way. I'll take you in for more interrogation unless you tell me exactly what you're doing here. You have a choice." Anger flashed through James's mind, but he controlled it. He was aware of this strategy, intimidating the other person and pressing until they broke. James said, "I've told you everything you need to know," in a level tone. "You're doing something incorrectly." Davis's jaw tightened. The only error I can think of is someone assuming they can move about this neighborhood unquestioned. Will you cooperate now, or do I have to escalate this? James was growing impatient. He had made an effort to explain and reason, but Davis was not paying attention. This was about control, about imposing his will on someone he saw as a danger based only on appearance, not about safety. James looked back at Davis after glancing at the onlookers. James said, "Officer, I'm not resisting," in a steady voice. "However, I am also aware of my rights. I haven't done anything wrong, so you have no reason to arrest me." Anger flashed in Davis's eyes. He snarled, "I'll decide what's wrong and what's right." Suddenly he extended his hand and took James's arm. "You're coming with me." As his training kicked in, James stiffened as Davis's hold tightened. Although he knew it would only make things worse, he could easily overwhelm the officer. Allow Davis to yank him in the direction of the patrol car. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, feeling the harshness of the cuffs being snapped onto his wrists. James asked in a firm but composed tone. Disregarding him, Davis pushed James to the rear of the vehicle. "Climb in." He let out a bark. With his hands cuffed behind him, James sat down in the back seat and complied. He glanced out at the throng of onlookers, who were wearing a mixture of worried and perplexed looks. The entire scene was being recorded by the woman with the dog who had her phone up. James hoped that would be sufficient to prevent further deterioration. A wave of frustration swept through James as Davis slammed the door. Because of the color of his skin and the presumptions that accompanied it, he was sitting in the back of a patrol car being treated like a criminal after having come out for a peaceful walk to clear his head. He could hear Davis radioing in, explaining the situation to the station in a tense voice. Leaning back in his seat, James inhaled deeply once more. He was aware that this was not yet finished. Even though he wanted to fight back, he knew he had to maintain his composure because this was about something much bigger than himself, something he had dealt with all of his life. James was reminded that the struggle for equality and respect was still ongoing as he sat in the back of a patrol car with his hands in handcuffs. The tension was evident despite the quiet ride to the police station. James was still restrained by the icy metal of his handcuffs as he sat in the rear of the patrol car. Officer Davis occasionally glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but he ignored it and continued to look straight ahead. The neighborhood's tree-lined streets gave way to the busy roads that led into town, and the surrounding landscape became blurry. James's thoughts were racing, not out of fear but rather in shock at how a routine stroll had devolved into this. Davis parked his car in a lot of police cars as he pulled into the station. Pulling open the back door, he grabbed James by the arm and stepped out. Officers were coming and going, chatting on radios and carrying files, and the station was humming with activity. A few officers looked at them, their eyes glimmering with curiosity as Davis escorted James inside. Ignoring them, Davis marched James toward the holding area down the hallway. James could hear the whispers and sense the other officers' gazes on him. Although he had previously been under investigation, this was the first time it had occurred in this manner, on the wrong side of the law he had vowed to uphold. James was being paraded through a police station like a regular criminal after having dedicated his life to maintaining law and order and protecting his nation. James was led into a tiny room by Davis, who pushed open a door. It was a standard holding room with 2 chairs, a table and blank walls. James was motioned to sit by Davis. Davis stood by the door with his arms crossed and a smug expression on his face as James obeyed. Davis said, "You'll stay here until we get this sorted out," in a clipped voice. James looked him in the eye evenly. "Officer, what precisely are we sorting out? My ID is with you. You are aware of my residence. What else are you in need of?" Davis's gaze grew stony. "Please tell me why you were in that area. Why did you think you could just go about as if you owned the place?" James let out a sigh, his annoyance seething beneath the surface. "I wasn't acting improperly. That's the neighborhood where I live. I haven't done anything to deserve this care." Davis's cheeks turned red. "People like you don't just walk around neighborhoods like that without a reason," he said. "You might have been searching for a chance by casing houses." James squinted his eyes. He said, "People like me, again. What exactly do you mean by that, officer?" Although Davis's jaw tensed, he remained silent. Tension permeated the room as it fell into an awkward silence. James was aware of Davis's rage and his desire to establish authority and make a point. James understood that this was about what he stood for to Davis, a disturbance of the order he so desperately tried to uphold, rather than about him personally. Sergeant Laura Smith entered as the door opened. A tall woman with short brown hair, she had a worried yet professional look on her face. Her eyes scanned the situation, first looking at James and then at Davis. She was calm, collected, a voice of reason in the midst of chaos, and James knew she was her type. "What's going on here?" Sergeant Smith's voice was steady as she asked. Davis stood up straight. "I noticed him acting suspiciously while strolling through the affluent neighborhood. Since he wouldn't give an explanation, I brought him in." Smith's eyes were fair but piercing as she gazed at James. "Is that true?" "True," James said with a small nod. "I went for a stroll. When Officer Davis asked me questions, I gave him my ID and said I lived close by. For him, that wasn't sufficient." Smith looked over at Davis. "And did you run his ID?" "Yes," said Davis hastily. "It came back clean, but..." Smith cut in, "But you still brought him in a firm voice. On what grounds?" Davis paused, obviously uneasy with Smith's attention. Insisting, "He was acting suspicious. I was doing my job keeping the neighborhood safe." Smith crossed her arms and sighed. "This man is a high-ranking general in the United States Army," she stated in a quiet yet distinct voice. "He was brought in without reason and in handcuffs too. Are you aware of the consequences of this?" Davis blinked, obviously surprised. He looked from Smith to James and back again. "I had no idea," he stumbled. Smith's gaze grew strained. "His identity shouldn't matter. This is unacceptable. Your job is to serve and protect, not to judge based on appearances." Davis let him go now. Davis stepped forward to unlock the cuffs after fumbling with the keys. James released his wrists and gave them a light rub, experiencing the pain of the metal's tight hold. Standing taller than Davis, he maintained a composed expression. "Sergeant Smith," James said with a steady tone, "thank you for your professionalism, but this isn't just about me. This is about how people like Officer Davis approach their duty." Smith gave a nod. "I concur. We'll talk about this more, General Adams. You can be sure that this incident will be handled properly." James turned to Davis, who still seemed in disbelief. James uttered the words, "I hope this is a wake-up call," quietly. "Judging someone by their appearance can lead to mistakes, dangerous ones." Smith pointed at the door. She said, "Let's take this to my office. We need to address what happened here today." James followed Smith out of the holding room, aware that the other officers were watching him. It was a beginning, but he knew it wasn't the end. If this was the catalyst, then so be it. Changes needed to be made and conversations needed to be had. James sat across from her as she started to write a report back in Smith's office. With a confused and embarrassed expression on his face, Davis was left standing outside. James contemplated the long journey ahead as he watched him through the glass window. The culture that permitted those acts to occur in the first place was more important than the actions of a single officer. This was another battle James had fought all his life, and he planned to finish it. The struggle for equality and respect permeated every street, community, and encounter. It didn't stop on the battlefield. Smith took a seat, staring up at James with her pen. She apologized. "I'm sorry for what happened. We'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed." James gave a nod. "It's not about apologies, Sergeant. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again to anyone." Smith gave a nod of agreement. "Officer Davis will be our first focus before examining the wider picture. Although it takes time for change to occur, it must begin somewhere." There was an uncomfortable silence in Sergeant Laura Smith's tiny office. With his hands on his knees and a composed yet alert expression, James sat across from her. Sergeant Smith was just finishing up his notes on James's version of events. As she contemplated her next move, she left her pen on the desk, forgotten. The hum of the station's operations continued outside, but the tension inside was almost tangible. Smith broke the silence with a deep breath. "General Adams," she started, "I want to reassure you that we don't do business the way we did today. Officer Davis acted inappropriately. Here, such behavior is not tolerated." James's expression remained neutral as he gave a slight nod. "Thank you, Sergeant, but I've witnessed too many incidents of this nature. It's not about a single officer. Rather, it's about the attitude that permits this to continue." Smith's eyes glowed with comprehension. She had worked in law enforcement long enough to understand that James was correct. The deeper problems that needed to be addressed were more important than a single incident. Incidents like this made her realize how far they still had to go, even though she had joined the force to make a difference and enforce the law fairly. "General Adams," Smith stated cautiously, "I would like to know more about your viewpoint on this. Your experience both now and over the course of your career, if you are open to it. It could give us insight into how to keep this from happening in the future." Leaning forward, James looked directly into Smith's eyes. "I've served my entire life, Sergeant. I've led troops, made combat decisions, handled a variety of crises and encountered prejudice, both silent and not so quiet. Today, however, was different. For simply walking around my own neighborhood, I received criminal treatment. Because of my appearance, I am viewed as a threat even though I have fought for this nation. Smith listened, her expression solemn. General, you're correct that occasionally we allow our personal prejudices to impair our judgment, but we're here to protect everyone. Davis. Although he has been a good officer, I have previously heard concerns regarding his behavior. James gave a nod. It's not only about punishing Davis, it's also about ensuring that all officers know that their responsibility is to protect, not to pass judgment. Racial profiling like this is risky. It creates distrust, and we've failed when the public doesn't trust our police. Smith glanced at her notes below. She had always taken pride in treating people fairly and with respect, but she was aware that not everyone felt the same way. We'll be conducting an internal investigation, said Smith. Davis will be suspended pending the outcome, but more than that, we need to look at how we train our officers, how we engage with the community. Smith's sincerity was appreciated by James. She seemed dedicated to genuine change, not just saying the right things. Education and training are a start, James stated, but accountability is even more important. Officers must realize that such behavior has repercussions for the community as a whole, not just the individual being profiled. Smith gave a nod. Holding Davis accountable will be our first priority before we examine our training initiatives. Building trust is more important than merely upholding the law. At that moment, Officer Davis appeared hesitant as the door to Smith's office opened. Smith motioned for him to enter. With his eyes darting between Smith and James, Davis entered the room and stood rigidly by the door. Officer Davis, Smith said in a measured voice, General Adams has given his version of events for today. As you are now aware, we have checked his background and he is a senior officer in the U.S. Army. Your behavior was inappropriate and unprofessional. Davis made an uncomfortable shift. Davis said defensively, I didn't know he was a general, with color rising in his face. I had the feeling that he was planning something. All I was doing was my job. Smith's eyes squinted a little. It is your responsibility to serve and protect everyone in this community, not to draw conclusions based only on appearance. You violated a man's rights, brought him in without reason, and handled him like a suspect. That's failing at your job, not doing it. Davis parted his lips as though to argue, then shut them again. He looked from Smith to James and back again. Davis muttered, I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. James got to his feet and turned to Davis. Officer, maintaining justice and treating everyone with respect is what safety is all about, not focusing on individuals who have a different appearance. You made me feel like a criminal in my own neighborhood while I was just out for a walk. No one is being kept safe by that. Davis drooped his shoulder a little. He avoided looking into James's eyes and looked down. I apologize, he muttered. This is not how I intended it to go. As he watched him, James noticed that Davis's apology seemed more genuine out of fear than comprehension. It's not just an apology, James stated. The goal is to ensure that no one experiences this again. Smith straightened her stance. You are suspended, Officer Davis, with immediate effect. Your behavior will be investigated, and additional measures will be implemented based on the findings. Davis gave a defeated nod. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, the door clicking softly behind him. Smith turned back to James after watching him leave. She said, We'll do better. James nodded and said, I'll make sure of it. I have faith in you, Sergeant, but keep in mind that the goal is to alter the culture that tolerates this kind of behavior, not just Davis. Officers like you are the first to demonstrate leadership. Smith returned to his seat, appearing contemplative. General, I appreciate your patience today. Your words will have an impact, even though I know it hasn't been easy. James inhaled deeply as he felt the burden of the day start to lessen. Sergeant, we all have a part to play. Let's play it well, shall we? He got up and held out his hand. Smith gave it a firm shake and they both silently agreed. James felt a sense of purpose as he walked out of the office. Despite being unsettling, this incident was an opportunity to bring about change. Making sure that no one else had to experience what he had was more important than just him. With a sense of resolve, James stepped out into the light. He still had a long way to go, but at least he was no longer traveling alone. Within the police station and the community at large, word swiftly spread about General James Adams's ordeal. Whispers had developed into full-fledged discussions by the following day. In break rooms, officers were huddled together, conversing quietly, with some of them looking at Officer Davis's vacant desk. Knowing that something important had occurred created a tense atmosphere in the station. More than merely a disciplinary measure, Davis's suspension served as a warning that things were about to change. At the morning briefing, Sergeant Laura Smith stood before the assembled officers, her tone steady and her face solemn. Officer Davis has been placed on leave while an internal investigation is conducted, as many of you are aware. Our standards were broken in the case of General James Adams. Treating everyone fairly and with respect is part of our mission to safeguard and assist everyone in our community. The room was filled with a murmur. While some officers nodded in agreement, others appeared uneasy and shifted in their chairs. Despite the differing responses, Smith persisted. The department as a whole is affected by what we do. We cannot afford for incidents like this to undermine public trust. We have an obligation to perform better and to uphold the highest moral standards. A young man named Officer Ramirez, one of the officers, held up his hand. What will happen to Davis, Sergeant? Smith looked him in the eye. The investigation will determine that. He is currently suspended, but I want to be clear that this is about more than just Davis. It's about ensuring that everyone knows how important their role is in this community. This department is not a place for racial profiling. As Smith's words weighed heavily on the officers, the room fell silent once more. She went on, "We'll be holding more training sessions on de-escalation techniques and racial sensitivity. I anticipate complete involvement. We must take this as a lesson and ensure that it doesn't occur again." Officers filed out of the room as the briefing came to an end, some whispering to one another and others lost in thought. Smith hoped her words had an effect as she watched them leave. Although she was aware that change would take time, it had to begin somewhere. General James Adams, meanwhile, had resumed his regular activities, although he still thought about the incident frequently. It was about the wider ramifications, not just what had happened to him. Smith had called James to update him on the investigation and the actions being taken to resolve the matter. Although he was aware that this was only the beginning, he still appreciated her efforts. James was invited to meet with representatives of the police department and community leaders that afternoon. They wanted to talk about what had transpired and what to do next. James concurred, realizing the significance of these discussions. The gathering took place in a large room with chairs arranged in a circle at a nearby community center. When James got there, he saw a variety of people, including local activists, police officers, and some locals. Officer Ramirez, Sergeant Smith, and other department personnel were present. Some of the community leaders were familiar to James, who had collaborated with them on a number of projects over the years. The meeting started. Anticipation permeated the atmosphere. An elderly woman with a gentle yet firm manner, Mr. Turner, a community leader, took the stage to speak to the group. She started by saying, "Thank you all for coming. An incident that exposed problems we can no longer overlook is the reason we're here today. We are grateful that you are willing to participate in this discussion and share your experience, General Adams." James nodded, aware that everyone in the room was watching him. Before he spoke, he inhaled deeply. "What happened to me was wrong," he stated bluntly, "but it's not just about me. It concerns how we make sure that everyone in our community is treated fairly, with respect, and feels safe. It has to do with responsibility." Collins, an officer seated beside Smith, raised his voice. "We wish to improve. Although we are dedicated to changing things, it will take time. What should we concentrate on, in your opinion?" James valued the question's transparency. When he said, "Start with training on how to interact with the community as well as racial sensitivity. Officers must realize that their job is to protect, not to threaten, and that those who cross the line must face clear repercussions." Mr. Turner gave a nod of approval. "The key is trust. There is a great deal of mistrust at the moment, particularly in minority communities. We must make sure the police are working with us, not against us." The next to speak was Sergeant Smith. "We're reviewing our stop and search policies and putting new training protocols into effect right away. Education and prevention are just as important as punishment. Our goal is to forge a partnership with the community rather than sow discord." Jordan, a local activist who had been listening in silence, held up his hand. He stated, "We need transparency, but it's good to hear that there's a commitment to change. We must be certain that problems are openly discussed and not ignored when they occur." James concurred. "Accountability and transparency are essential. Actions must be taken. Words alone are insufficient. People must perceive that their opinions are valued and that changes are being made." The discussion went on, touching on a number of subjects, including the significance of officers being viewed as allies rather than enforcers, regular meetings between police and residents, and community engagement programs. Agreements were reached, ideas were exchanged, and a cautious optimism started to grow. Sergeant Smith came up to James as the meeting was coming to an end. She said, "Thank you for being here. Your advice is really helpful. Even though we still have a long way to go, I think we can truly make an impact." James gave her a handshake. "Although it's difficult, change is essential. To ensure that everyone feels safe in this community, I'm prepared to collaborate with each and every one of you." Smith gave a nod, her eyes full of resolve. "We'll do it together." James felt hopeful as he walked out of the community center. The discussions had been open and helpful. The seeds of change had been sown, but much more needed to be done. Although James was aware that genuine change would require patience, time, and a great deal of work, he was prepared to see it through for the benefit of his community, himself, and all those who supported equality and justice. Although they had a long road ahead, James felt that they were moving in the right direction for the first time in a long time. Now there was a different vibe in the police station. The morning briefings, which had previously seemed routine, had taken on a new seriousness after Officer James Davis's suspension sent a strong message. Accountability, professionalism, and respect were given more weight. Officers were required to attend training sessions on de-escalation techniques and racial sensitivity, which led to awkward but essential discussions. During one of these meetings, Officer Ramirez sat with his fellow officers and listened to a community relations team instructor discuss the significance of identifying unconscious bias. As he listened, Ramirez, who had been on the force for a few years and thought of himself as fair and just, acknowledged that he had also made snap decisions based on appearances without even realizing it. Officers were urged to examine their conduct and consider the potential effects of their actions on others during the session. Ramirez met Sergeant Laura Smith in the hallway following the training. In an effort to bring about significant change in the department, she had been planning these meetings. Both the resolve and the fatigue were visible in her eyes. Changing a long-standing, deeply rooted culture was not simple. "Sergeant, these training sessions are opening a lot of eyes," said Ramirez. "Other officers now seem to be discussing things in a different way. Seems to be working." Smith gave him a quick glance while a tiny smile tugged at her mouth. Her words, "That's the goal, Beto. We must start somewhere, but we can't expect things to change overnight. Every discussion we have and each officer who begins to think differently is a positive step." Ramirez gave a nod. "The events involving Davis and General Adams have been on my mind a lot. Although it may not be as evident, I have also made mistakes by passing judgment on others before speaking with them. I'm learning that from this training." Smith touched Ramirez on the shoulder. "Everybody has made mistakes. What matters is that we improve and gain knowledge from them. Progress, not perfection, is the goal. Your acknowledgement of this indicates that we are making progress." Smith couldn't help but feel optimistic as they strolled on. The department had been rocked by the incident involving General James Adams, but it had also spurred something significant: introspection, awareness, and a sincere desire to get better. Although she was aware that there would still be opposition from officers who thought nothing needed to change, she also knew that many were beginning to see the importance of this. In the meantime, James Adams was feeling the repercussions of his experience. Neighbors called and messaged him, some offering their support and others expressing regret for not stepping in to stop him from being arrested. Knowing that his experience had opened many eyes outside of the police department, James was grateful for the outreach. James received an invitation to speak at a community forum hosted by the Neighborhood Association one afternoon. In order to restore confidence and address issues, the forum sought to promote communication between locals and law enforcement. James concurred, understanding the significance of these discussions. That evening, the community center was crowded, with residents occupying the seats and a group of officers, including Officer Ramirez and Sergeant Smith, standing at the rear. Gazing out at the faces in front of him, James stepped onto the stage. The crowd was a mix of interest, worry, and optimism. James's voice was steady as he spoke. "I appreciate everyone's presence. Although what happened to me was challenging, it has strengthened our bond. I want to begin tonight by stating that I think community is powerful. I am confident that we can collaborate to establish a secure and welcoming atmosphere for all." He took a moment to allow his words to resonate with the audience. But doing so forces us to face hard realities. The existence of bias and prejudice must be acknowledged. We must realize that safety is about more than just preventing crime. It's also about making sure that everyone, no matter how they look, feels appreciated and respected. A senior citizen in the front row held up his hand. "I've been in this neighborhood for more than 30 years, General Adams," he said. "Although I've seen it change, I never imagined this kind of thing would occur here." How can we ensure that it doesn't occur again? James gave a nod. Awareness is the first step, he answered. Awareness of our own prejudices and the impact of our actions on other people. The new training being implemented by the police department is for everyone, not just the officers. We must be accountable to one another. We must speak up if we witness something that is wrong. It's about taking action to establish trust. A young woman in the back raised her hand once more. As residents, what are our options? How can we assist in becoming involved? Go to these forums, talk to your neighbors, and get to know the officers who patrol our streets, James advised. Our community gets stronger the more we participate. It's about fostering understanding and relationships. Sergeant Smith took his place at the front, joining James. She asserted that General Adams was correct. We need your assistance, but we're dedicated to changing the department. As your police force, we aim to provide you with efficient service. Our goals are to learn, to listen, and to get better. Residents shared their worries, queries, and recommendations during the more than 1 hour-long forum. In stark contrast to the tension that had pervaded the air following James's arrest, the atmosphere was one of openness and respect. At the end of the night, everyone felt united and committed to continuing together. When the crowd started to thin out, James was encircled by neighbors who wanted to shake his hand, express gratitude for his voice, or talk about their own experiences. As he listened, he offered words of understanding and support. He sensed the strength that came from standing together and the power of community. As the room started to empty, Sergeant Smith came up to James. She remarked, "That was powerful. You've had a significant influence. People are paying attention." James grinned. "Sergeant, this is only the beginning. We must continue the conversation that we have begun. Although it takes time for change to occur, tonight was a positive step." Smith gave a nod of agreement. "With each other, we will continue to advance." That evening, James had a fresh sense of direction as he walked out of the community center. The last few days had been difficult, but they had also been life-changing. The tides were slowly but surely turning. Though he was prepared for it, James was aware that there would be more work to be done and more discussions to have. For the first time in a long time, James felt hopeful because change was taking place. He inhaled deeply as he gazed up at the night sky, which was full of brilliant stars. He believed they were headed in the right direction, but there was still a long way to go. A new consciousness had descended on the neighborhood and the police department a few weeks after the community forum. In the living rooms of homes and the corridors of the police station, discussions about justice, prejudice, and respect persisted. It was widely acknowledged that although there had been some progress, much more needed to be done. James Adams went back to his regular walks as he had before the incident, but something felt different this time. The suspicious looks had been replaced by waves of friendship and nods of recognition. He was now greeted with smiles by neighbors who had previously avoided him, keen to talk. These small actions were appreciated by James because they showed that his message had been understood and that change, even if it was slow, was beginning to take hold. The autumn leaves crunched beneath James's feet as he walked down the well-known tree-lined streets one crisp morning. The sound of laughter filled the air as he passed a group of kids playing in their front yard. As she went by, a woman who was out walking her dog nodded and smiled warmly at him. She yelled, "Good morning, General Adams." "Good morning," James said, cocking his head back. James saw a patrol car coming slowly from the other direction as he carried on walking. The memory of his last encounter caused his muscles to tense for a brief moment. However, he recognized Officer Ramirez behind the wheel as the car got closer. The window was rolled down by Ramirez. I grinned and lowered his window. "Good morning, General Ramirez," he said in a cordial tone. "How's your day going?" The smile was returned by James, who felt relaxed. "I'm doing fine, Officer Ramirez. Simply enjoying the weather outside." Ramirez gave a nod. "That's good to hear. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you need anything at all. After all, the community is the reason we are here." The sentiment was appreciated by James. "I'm grateful, officer. Seeing things go in the right direction is encouraging." James was overcome with gratitude as Ramirez drove away. The shift in mindset and people's willingness to participate and learn were more important than merely new training initiatives or policy changes. As James walked on, he passed more neighbors who nodded and said hello to him. Once a place of condemnation, the neighborhood was starting to feel more like home. Sergeant Laura Smith and James were to meet at the police station later that day. She had asked him to talk about the current reforms and get his opinion on how they were going. James noticed the change in the atmosphere as he walked into the station. There was a feeling of professionalism and purpose. Officers made deliberate movements, with a few stopping to say hello to James as he went by. The sergeant stood in Smith's office and shook James's hand firmly. "General Adams, I appreciate you coming. Have a seat, please." James took a seat and appreciated Smith's straightforward style. He respected her ability to get right to the point. Smith said, "I wanted to update you on the investigation. Officer Davis has been officially relieved of his duties. His actions were found to be against departmental policies by the investigation. His termination served as a benchmark for what we anticipate from our officers, not merely as a form of discipline." James gave a nod. "I believe that was the right choice. Davis's actions damaged the community's trust in the police, and his behavior was unacceptable." Smith looked thoughtful as he sighed. "Letting someone go is a difficult task, but we require officers who are dedicated to justice and fairness. We've put new training procedures into place and are emphasizing community involvement. Monthly workshops on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation are now mandatory for officers. To keep the lines of communication open, we're also planning frequent community gatherings." This was good news for James, Sergeant. "These are crucial steps. The way the officers are engaging with the community is one area where I've already noticed a change. It has been altered. Individuals feel heard." Smith grinned. "Positive feedback has been given to us. The community is more open to interacting with us and feels more connected. Seeing how a small shift in mindset can have a significant impact is heartening." James spoke gravely as he leaned forward. "We can't stop here though. We must maintain this momentum. Culture is more important than training and policies alone. We must establish a respectful culture in which all officers are aware of their responsibility to serve and protect everyone without favoritism." Smith gave a nod. "I concur. Although we've made strides, more work needs to be done. I'm determined to finish this, and I'm sure that others are too." James got to his feet and held out his hand again. "I appreciate your leadership and your serious approach, Sergeant. Although change is difficult, we can all work together to change things." Smith gave him a firm handshake. "General Adams, thank you. These changes are the result of your bravery in speaking up. We'll remember that." James felt a sense of closure as he walked out of the station. After beginning with suspicion and animosity, the incident resulted in fruitful discussion and genuine change. It served as a reminder that even challenging circumstances can present chances for development. Although James was pleased with the actions they had taken, he understood that being vigilant was essential. It took consistent work and dedication to fight for justice and equality.